Real whale carcasses almost never wash up where scientists can study them, and nobody can predict where one will sink next. A Chinese research team solved that problem with a stand-in nobody expected. A full-size dead cow lowered more than a mile into the South China Sea. They pointed cameras at the seafloor and waited. What arrived out of the darkness had never been recorded in that stretch of ocean before. Why scientists use a cow instead of a whale. When a whale dies naturally at sea, its body sometimes sinks straight to the ocean floor, landing in complete darkness thousands of meters down. Scientists call this event a whale fall, and it creates a sudden burst of food in a part of the ocean that almost never gets any at all. Most of the deep sea floor survives on nothing more than a thin, steady drizzle of dead plankton and tiny scraps drifting down from the surface. So a single whale carcass landing all at once is closer to an entire grocery store appearing out of nowhere in the middle of a desert. The problem is that nobody can predict when or where a whale is going to die, and the ocean is far too big to just go looking for one on purpose. Oceanographer Craig Smith stumbled onto the very first documented whale fall completely by accident in 1987. When two of his graduate students brought up footage from a final submersible dive off the coast of California. What they found sitting on the seafloor at 1,200 meters was a gray whale skeleton, already covered in scavengers nobody expected to see, feeding together in one place. In the decades since that first discovery, researchers have only managed to find about 24 more whale falls in the wild, since actual carcasses are rare, scattered, and often located in places nobody happens to be looking at the exact right moment. Most of the ocean floor still has never been surveyed closely enough for anyone to notice a carcass sitting there, even if one exists nearby right now. Because real whale falls are so hard to come by, some research teams have started building their own on purpose. Researchers from the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute, known as MBARI, have sunk 5 whale carcasses over the last 15 years at different depths, including one nicknamed Patrick, that was lowered 1,800 meters down into Monterey Canyon. Getting hold of one of these whales is its own strange story. Deals sometimes get struck with Coast Guard and wildlife officials, where researchers agree to intercept a floating dead whale before it drifts too close to shore, since removing a beached whale carcass from a public beach is apparently a far harder and messier problem than towing one out to deep water and sinking it on purpose. Whales that wash up on land often have to be buried or hauled away using heavy machinery at real expense to local governments, while a whale intercepted at sea and towed out to a research site turns that same body into years of usable scientific data instead. A cow carcass works as an even cheaper, more available substitute for teams who cannot get their hands on an actual whale. And that is exactly the shortcut a group of researchers in China decided to try. A cow is easy to source, easy to transport, and does not require special government permits the way handling a protected marine mammal carcass often does. What the researchers were hoping to recreate on a smaller scale is a process that scientists have now spent decades mapping out in careful, patient detail, one that unfolds in distinct stages, almost like watching a tiny world be born, grow, and eventually fade away. What a whale fall normally looks like. A whale fall does not just sit there quietly and slowly vanish. Scientists have documented that it moves through at least 3 separate phases, each one bringing in a completely different set of animals depending on what food source is left. The first phase, called the mobile scavenger stage, brings in fast-moving hunters like sleeper sharks, 6-gill sharks, hagfish, and rat-tail fish, all of which tear away the easy soft tissue, blubber, and organs. This stage alone can strip a massive carcass shockingly fast, since researchers studying whale falls off the California coast found that scavengers in this first wave can consume between 40 and 60 kilograms of tissue every single day, meaning a 5-ton carcass can be reduced to bare bones in roughly 4 months. Hagfish deserve a closer look here, since they are some of the strangest animals involved in the entire process. These eel-shaped scavengers do not just bite off chunks from the outside. They burrow directly into the carcass and digest it from the inside out, using a slime-covered, nearly boneless body built for squeezing into impossibly tight spaces most other predators could never reach. A single hagfish can produce an enormous cloud of slime almost instantly if threatened, thick enough to clog the gills of any predator foolish enough to try biting one. Giant isopods join the same feeding wave, oversized cousins of the small pill bugs people find under rocks in a garden. Except these can grow to sizes that let them dig into a carcass and gorge for days at a time, then retreat into the sediment and stay motionless for weeks afterward to conserve energy in an environment where the next meal might not arrive for a very long time. Once the bulk of the soft material is gone, a second wave of animals moves in during what researchers call the enrichment opportunist stage. This wave includes worms, snails, crabs, squat lobsters, and mussels, all settling into the leftover sediment and exposed bone, feeding on smaller scraps and nutrients the first wave left behind or buried in the mud underneath the carcass. This stage can stretch on for up to 2 years, slowly working through whatever organic material remains trapped around the skeleton, with populations of tiny worms, sometimes reaching numbers in the thousands, packed into just a few square meters of seafloor mud. The final and strangest phase is called the sulfophilic stage, meaning sulfur-loving, and it runs on chemistry rather than teeth. As the remaining bone keeps breaking down, it releases a chemical called hydrogen sulfide, which fuels a process called chemosynthesis, letting certain bacteria turn that chemical into usable energy, the same basic way plants turn sunlight into energy through photosynthesis. Thick, multicolored bacterial mats bloom across the exposed bones during this stage, sometimes glowing yellow or a strange grayish-purple depending on depth and chemistry, feeding still more specialized creatures that show up almost nowhere else on the planet. This final stage alone can last for decades, meaning a single dead whale can quietly support an entire changing community of life for longer than most human careers last. One of the strangest creatures that shows up during this stage does not even have a mouth, and it survives entirely by eating the whale's own skeleton from the inside out, a detail worth coming back to later in this story. The actual experiment. In June 2025, a research team led by Han Tian, working through Sun Yat-sen University and the Southern Marine Science and Engineering Guangdong Laboratory in China, published their results in the journal Ocean Land Atmosphere Research. Their plan was straightforward on paper: investigate what happens when a whale carcass falls to the ocean floor by simulating that exact event artificially. To pull this off, they lowered a full-sized cow carcass down to 1,629 meters on the continental slope near Hainan Island in the South China Sea, a depth deep enough to sit well past the reach of sunlight and firmly inside the kind of cold, high-pressure environment where whale falls are normally found. Transporting and lowering an entire cow carcass down more than a mile of open water is not a simple task. It requires careful rigging to keep the carcass from tumbling or drifting sideways during descent, a dedicated support vessel stationed above the drop site, and deep-sea camera equipment built to survive crushing pressure and total darkness for weeks at a stretch, all pointed steadily at one exact spot on the seafloor, while researchers waited to see who might show up first. Equipment like this, often called a deep-sea lander, has to run on battery power for extended stretches since there is no practical way to run a cable down that far and keep it stable against ocean currents, meaning every recording session has a limited window before the equipment needs retrieving and recharging. If you're enjoying this deep dive, hitting subscribe means you won't miss the next one. The researchers expected a fairly predictable outcome, based on decades of whale fall research conducted elsewhere. A slow trickle of smaller scavengers working through the carcass gradually over the course of months, following roughly the same three-stage pattern documented on real whale falls. What actually showed up on camera threw that entire plan off course almost immediately, and it involved animals that had no obvious business being anywhere near that particular stretch of ocean. The visitors' nobody-expected video footage captured by the deep-sea monitoring equipment revealed a procession of 8 large, slow-moving creatures gliding silently through the darkness to investigate the cow carcass. For a moment, even the scientists running the experiment were caught completely off guard, since these were not animals known to frequent this particular part of the world at all. The visitors turned out to be Pacific sleeper sharks, a species named Somniosus pacificus, and their appearance marked the first time this shark had ever been formally recorded in the South China Sea. Pacific sleeper sharks are usually associated with cold, far northern waters spread across the North Pacific, sometimes found near Alaska, Japan, and the deeper stretches of the open ocean in between, which made their sudden appearance in this specific southern region even more unexpected to the researchers watching the footage roll in. These are not small animals, and they are not built for speed. Pacific sleeper sharks are slow-moving, deep-dwelling predators that can grow to serious size, with a body built for a life spent cruising quietly near the bottom of cold, dark water, rather than chasing fast prey near the surface the way more famous sharks do. Their name comes from that same slow, almost sluggish swimming style, gliding rather than sprinting, conserving energy in an environment where meals are rare and hard to come by. Finding 8 of them together, feeding calmly on the same carcass in a region with no prior scientific record of the species, immediately raised a much bigger question than the researchers had originally set out to answer with this experiment. The strange table manners of a predator. Sharks have a reputation built almost entirely around chaos, a frenzy of teeth and thrashing bodies tearing into food the instant it appears in the water. That is not what the cameras recorded near Hainan Island. Despite their reputation as solitary deep-sea hunters, the 8 sleeper sharks did not simply descend on the carcass in a feeding frenzy the way smaller reef sharks or great whites often do near the surface. Instead, the footage showed something closer to an organized system. The sharks approached the carcass in sequence, one at a time, with some individuals appearing to yield their position to others that arrived later, forming what researchers described as an apparent queuing pattern that hints at a form of silent negotiation happening between them in near total darkness. Han Tian, the study's lead researcher, put the finding plainly, explaining that this behavior suggests feeding priority gets determined by each individual shark's own competitive intensity, even in a deep water environment where visibility sits close to zero and body language would be almost impossible for one shark to read from another. That kind of orderly turn-taking among animals usually described as solitary loners is not something researchers typically expect to document on a random deep-sea camera rig planted in an unfamiliar part of the ocean. It suggests these sharks may have far more complex social behavior around food than most people, including plenty of scientists, ever gave them credit for. Sleeper sharks live such quiet, rarely observed lives that even basic details about how they interact with each other have stayed largely a mystery, until footage like this happens to catch them in the act. That discovery alone would have made the experiment worthwhile on its own, but it also opened up a much less comfortable question about why these particular sharks were gathered there at all. Why sharks showing up where they shouldn't be matters. Pacific sleeper sharks are not supposed to be common visitors to the South China Sea. Their usual range sits much further north, in colder water spread across the North Pacific, which is exactly why researchers were so surprised to see 8 of them appear together on camera at once, feeding calmly on a random cow carcass in an area with no earlier confirmed sightings. The researchers behind the study raised the possibility that climate change and other broader environmental shifts may have contributed to this species expanding its range into new parts of the ocean it has not historically occupied. Ocean temperatures do not need to shift by very much to change where a cold water species is willing to travel and hunt. Water that is even slightly warmer than a species evolved to tolerate can push that animal toward deeper water, different latitudes, or entirely new regions in search of a stable temperature range and enough food to survive. If a slow-moving, deep-dwelling shark built specifically for cold water conditions is now showing up regularly in a warmer regional sea it once avoided, that shift could be an early warning sign of much larger changes rippling through deep water ecosystems that almost nobody gets the chance to observe directly, since so little of the deep ocean gets monitored on any kind of regular basis. Scientists studying other whale fall sites thousands of kilometers away have already started noticing similarly troubling signs tied to warming water, and that pattern becomes much harder to dismiss once you look closely at what has been happening on the opposite side of the Pacific Ocean over roughly the same stretch of years. Before getting to that separate warning sign, though, it helps to understand exactly what this cow carcass experiment did and did not manage to prove. Since the sharks did not just surprise the researchers watching the footage, they completely changed the actual outcome of the study itself. What the experiment actually proved and what it missed. The original goal of the study was to observe the classic stages of decomposition and scavenging that researchers have carefully documented on real whale falls for decades. The slow progression from mobile scavengers to enrichment opportunists to bacterial mats spread out over months and sometimes years. That kind of staged breakdown normally unfolds gradually as different waves of animals move in one after another, each group finishing its part of the job before handing the leftovers off to the next. The sleeper sharks never gave this particular ecosystem the chance to unfold that way. The experiment ultimately failed to achieve its original intended purpose once the group of sharks appeared and consumed the bait far faster than researchers could properly study the slower stages of decomposition they had originally set out to observe and record. In other words, the cow carcass got eaten far too quickly and by far larger animals than anyone involved had expected, cutting the planned experiment short before the smaller scavengers, opportunist species, and bacterial stages ever had a real chance to develop and move in. Even so, the researchers were careful to note that the experiment was not a failure in any meaningful scientific sense. It still produced a genuinely valuable, previously undocumented record of Pacific sleeper shark feeding behavior, along with a first confirmed sighting of the species in an entirely new region of ocean. Sometimes the most useful scientific result is not the one a team originally planned for at all, and that unplanned outcome points directly toward a much larger, ongoing story about what typically happens once the sharks and other large scavengers finish their share of the meal and move on to somewhere else. The real zombie worms and the bigger picture. On a typical whale fall left undisturbed by unexpected visitors, once the big scavengers move on, a much stranger cast of characters takes over the leftover skeleton. Female Osedax worms, nicknamed zombie worms by researchers studying them, have no mouth and no digestive system of any kind. Instead, they send root-like structures directly into the whale's bones, secreting acid to slowly dissolve the hard mineral material, while symbiotic bacteria living inside those roots break down fats and proteins and pass the resulting nutrients straight to the worm itself, almost like the worm running a chemical factory in its own basement that feeds it around the clock. Male Osedax worms are microscopic by comparison, living out their entire lives inside the body of a single female, an arrangement scientists still consider one of the stranger reproductive setups found anywhere in the ocean. These worms were first formally described in the July 30th, 2004, issue of the journal Science, and scientists have since identified dozens of related species living on whale skeletons scattered across oceans all over the world. Researchers studying this genus, including Craig Smith, have estimated that more than 600,000 whale skeletons likely rest quietly on the ocean floor worldwide at any given moment, each one representing a potential home for these strange bone-eating worms and the wider community of specialized creatures that ends up depending on them. That number puts the cow carcass experiment into a much bigger context than one shark sighting alone. Every single whale skeleton sitting undisturbed somewhere on the seafloor is its own tiny temporary ecosystem, complete with its own rotating cast of scavengers, opportunists, and bacteria working through the same three predictable stages. Alongside the worms come other rare specialists rarely seen anywhere else, including a group of clams called vesicamides that host chemosynthetic bacteria inside their own tissue, extracting energy from inorganic chemicals the same way the surrounding bacterial mats do, and rubispirus snails that graze directly on the bacteria growing across the bones. This entire hidden network of life, built entirely around one dead animal at a time, has apparently been happening on the ocean floor for a very long time, stretching back long before any human ever thought to go looking for it. Researchers have found fossilized whale bones on the ocean floor showing the exact same telltale signs of this process. Chemical staining and pitting patterns matching modern whale fall sites almost exactly, with some fossil evidence dating back to the Oligocene period, tens of millions of years before anyone would ever build a submersible or lower a camera into the deep. That timeline suggests this entire hidden ecosystem, one built entirely around the recycling of a single dead animal, has quietly repeated itself across the ocean floor for an almost unimaginable stretch of time, largely unnoticed and completely unrecorded, until researchers finally got the equipment needed to go looking for it directly. Researchers are still working out exactly how fragile that ancient ongoing system might be today, and one recent discovery, made only a few weeks before this document was written, suggests that fragility might already be showing serious cracks. When zombie worms started disappearing, a 10-year research project led by Fabio De Leo of Ocean Networks Canada, working alongside Craig Smith, placed humpback whale bones directly on the ocean floor off the coast of British Columbia and then watched them continuously using high-resolution underwater cameras connected to a permanent seafloor observatory. After a full decade of steady monitoring, the team found something researchers did not expect and clearly did not want to find. Despite the well-documented role zombie worms normally play in breaking down whale bones on nearly every other studied whale fall site, the cameras never once captured any Osedax colonization at all during the entire length of the study. The team also noticed a second troubling warning sign showing up in the same data. A wood-boring bivalve called Xylophaga, normally found colonizing submerged wood samples at a fairly predictable rate, showed up at that same experimental site, but colonized far more slowly than researchers typically observe in more oxygen-rich waters elsewhere. Craig Smith connected both findings directly to the ongoing expansion of low-oxygen zones in the ocean, a well-documented consequence of ocean warming, warning publicly that this kind of environmental stress could spell serious trouble for whale fall and wood fall ecosystems stretching across the entire Northeast Pacific region, not just the one specific site his team happened to be watching. Smith went further, explaining that the loss of these small island-like habitats scattered across the seafloor could eventually sever the connections that let Osedax species spread and interbreed across huge distances in the first place, since these worms rely on drifting larvae to find new bones to colonize once an old carcass gets fully picked clean. If those connections between distant whale fall sites break down permanently, researchers worry that entire regional populations of these bone-eating worms could gradually shrink and lose genetic diversity, even if the species itself does not disappear completely everywhere at once. Put side by side, these two studies tell a genuinely uncomfortable story unfolding on opposite sides of the very same ocean. What all this says about the deep ocean. None of this started with any interest in monsters, myths, or dramatic headlines. A team of scientists simply wanted to study decomposition up close, chose a cow carcass because a real whale was not available on short notice, and ended up documenting an entirely unplanned first sighting of a major predator species behaving in a way nobody had properly recorded before anywhere in the scientific literature. That kind of accidental discovery happens more often in deep-sea research than most people realize, simply because so little of the ocean floor has ever been observed carefully, consistently, or for very long at all. The bigger pattern connecting the sleeper sharks near Hainan Island and the missing zombie worms off British Columbia is not really about sharks or worms specifically, even though both make for a genuinely fascinating story on their own. It is about how sensitive these hidden, rarely seen deep ocean ecosystems appear to be to even small, gradual shifts in water temperature and oxygen levels. Shifts most people living on the surface of the planet will never notice happening at all in their own daily lives. A dead cow lowered nearly a mile into the South China Sea and a decade of whale bones tracked quietly off the coast of Canada both ended up telling versions of the exact same underlying story, just from two very different corners of the same connected ocean. Giant isopods still curl up and wait in the mud between meals. Hagfish still burrow headfirst into whatever soft tissue happens to sink down from above. Six-gill sharks and rat-tail fish still show up first at almost every known whale fall site, just as they have for millions of years according to the fossil record buried in the seafloor. What appears to be changing, slowly and quietly, is exactly which animals show up where, and exactly which ones might eventually stop showing up at all if ocean conditions keep shifting the way current data suggests they are. Verdict: here is where things actually stand. In June 2025, researchers led by Han Tian at Sun Yat-sen University lowered a cow carcass 1,629 meters into the South China Sea near Hainan Island, hoping to simulate a whale fall and study the animals that normally scavenge one over a period of months. Instead of a slow parade of small, deep-sea creatures moving through the usual three-stage process, 8 Pacific sleeper sharks showed up almost immediately, marking the first confirmed sighting of that species in the region and displaying an orderly, turn-taking feeding pattern nobody had expected from animals usually described in the scientific literature as solitary. The sharks ate the carcass too quickly for researchers to observe the classic decomposition stages documented on real whale falls ever since Craig Smith's original 1987 discovery, stages that normally include mobile scavengers like hagfish and giant isopods, enrichment opportunists like crabs and worms, and finally bone-eating Osedax worms feeding slowly through chemosynthesis over the course of decades. Those same zombie worms turned up completely missing in a separate 10-year study conducted off British Columbia, led by Fabio De Leo and Craig Smith, a result both researchers tied directly to low oxygen conditions driven by broader ocean warming trends. What actually showed up when scientists dropped a dead cow into the deep ocean was not a monster pulled from any old sailor story. It was real, documented evidence of predators shifting into unfamiliar territory, and a whale fall ecosystem, one that has quietly recycled the bodies of the ocean's largest animals for tens of millions of years, showing genuine, measurable signs of strain in at least one corner of the Pacific Ocean right now. If this kind of deep ocean mystery is your thing, subscribing helps more of these stories reach you the moment they come out.